Hello and welcome to Middle East Matters, our weekly look back at the region's big news stories. I'm Melissa Bell. Coming up on today's show, a job as dangerous as it is essential. What's it like being a doctor in Aleppo at the moment? We'll be speaking to one man who's just trying to do his job. Even as the fight against the Islamic State group intensifies in Iraq, Baghdad's restaurant scene appears to be thriving. We'll be taking you on this show on a culinary tour of Baghdad. And 3 years after the Taksim protests that so challenged the rule of Recep Tayyip Erdogan, what's happened to those who took to the streets in their millions? For months now, Aleppo has been the focus of a vicious battle between regime forces, Islamic State group fighters, rebels and Kurdish troops. Thousands of civilians remain trapped inside the city with little in the way of either food or medical supplies. Hospitals, in fact, have increasingly become targets, with dozens of doctors killed over the last few months in the city. Those that haven't died have, for the most part, fled. So what is it like for the few that remain? France 24 spoke to one doctor who lives and works in the west of Aleppo, which is controlled by the regime. Julien Cheida met up with him.
The sanitary condition in Aleppo is very bad because we lack water. Water supply was cut 3 years ago. We lack electricity and we lack medical supplies and drugs. Aleppo is divided in two zones. One, the east zone, which is under rebels' control, and the west side, which is under the government control. On the west side, there are still 1,000 to 1,500 doctors still working in Aleppo West. In Aleppo, in the east of Aleppo, the estimation is between 30 and 40 doctors there. The difficulties is to find the medical supplies and the equipment because of the sanctions of USA and the European Union. We are not allowed to import medical supplies. We are not allowed to make bank transfer. So we cannot replace our equipment, and this is very, very bad. And for the drugs, we have the ordinary drugs for hypertension, diabetes are available in Syria. But all the new drugs that are very important to treat the severely wounded patient, we don't have them.
Across Syria's border in Iraq, meanwhile, the fight against the Islamic State group intensified this week. In Fallujah, special Iraqi forces entered the center of the city for the final phase of an operation to recapture it after being in the hands of the Islamic State group for 2 years. Farther north, meanwhile, thousands of Kurdish Peshmerga troops launched an offensive to retake the formerly Kurdish villages near the jihadist-held town of Mosul, Iraq's second largest. Well, as so often, the consequences of the intensification of that fighting have been worst of all for civilians. To put it in figures for you, in 2015, 16,000 civilians were killed in Iraq, 4 times more than in 2012. Well, despite that, the restaurant business in the country's capital appears to be thriving, with a new restaurant opening its doors in Baghdad every 3 days. Proof, if it were needed, of the crucial place that food holds in Iraqi culture. Our correspondents report.
It's springtime for restaurants in Baghdad. There are over 3,000 of them, 40% more than in 2013, in spite of worsening economic and security conditions. Oyun Baghdad and its 5 stars is among the highest rated, hosting the capital's bourgeoisie in its nostalgic 1920s interior.
You know the situation of our city, Baghdad, or our country, Iraq. It's difficult. So the first choice in Iraq or in Baghdad to be refreshed or be relaxed is the restaurant and cafe.
One of the central actors of Baghdad's culinary scene is Inas al-Sarraf, the country's only food critic, a passion that costs him a third of his monthly salary. In the last 4 years, he's been to over 1,000 restaurants.
The businessman who's have industry, for example, before, have hotels, have construction company. Now they change to spend that more, invest that money in the restaurant, because the restaurant is good income. Every day they will, for $2,000 or $4,000.
He's created an online guide to the city's restaurants, but advising Iraqis on where to get the best food in town has its risks.
If I go in to take picture for a restaurant that is red zone area, let's get a taxi from terrorists, for example, they will stop me. Oh, are you going to make a target about us? Are you from terrorists? So a lot of troubles,
Haji Salam has also been surfing on this culinary wave. He just inaugurated the third location of Skuzi, his East meets West fusion restaurant chain. He invested $2 million in this venture, but he's confident he'll get rewards.
In spite of everything that's happening here, the security issues, etc., Iraqi families keep going to restaurants. It's a known fact that in Iraq, food is one of the few things that will keep going.
This is one of the capital's most popular eateries, and it's been hit by terrorist attacks 3 times. To rebuild it, Abu Ahmed's had to spend $20,000 each time, but closing shop's never been an option.
They can blow things up, kill, slash people's throats, start fires, but we're staying.
In Baghdad, a restaurant is one of the few sources of enjoyment left, and also a challenge to terrorism.
In other news this week, Iranian Muslims won't be going to Mecca this year for the traditional pilgrimage in September. Teheran and Riyadh blame one another for failing to agree on the logistics. This just 1 year after the deadly stampede that left thousands of pilgrims dead. Here's Shona Bhattacharya with more.
It's one of the highlights of the annual Hajj pilgrimage, the so-called stoning of the devil. But this September, none of the stone throwers will be Iranian. Tehran accuses Saudi Arabian authorities of putting pilgrims' lives in danger and says it's boycotting the religious event. Riyadh fired back, slamming Iran for seeking to impose, quote, unacceptable conditions.
Iran has demanded the right to organize demonstrations and to have privileges that go beyond the usual logistics. This would cause chaos during the Hajj pilgrimage.
Last year, a deadly stampede left over 700 people dead, according to official Saudi figures. But the Associated Press says the actual death toll was in fact much higher, at 2,400, with more than 400 Iranians among the victims. In early 2016, simmering tensions came to a boil when the kingdom executed a prominent Shiite cleric, prompting angry protesters to storm the Saudi embassy in Tehran. The move led Riyadh to cut diplomatic ties with its rival and neighbor. In addition to exacerbating sectarian tensions, the boycott is likely to hit the kingdom financially. Religious tourism is an $18 billion a year industry in Saudi Arabia, and Iranians make up one of the largest groups of pilgrims. This isn't the first time Iranian Muslims are officially denied access to Saudi Arabia's holy sites. In the late 1980s, the Hajj pilgrimage was off limits to Iranians for 3 years after a confrontation between Shiite worshippers and Saudi Arabian security forces.
It was 3 years ago that a small but determined group of protesters gathered in Gezi Park near Taksim Square in Istanbul. Their protest was to turn into a major political crisis for the government of Recep Tayyip Erdogan, bringing an estimated 2.5 million people out onto the streets. In the space of just 10 days, 8 people were killed and 8,000 wounded. 3 years on, what's become of the Taksim Square protesters? Our Istanbul correspondent Fatma Kiziboga went to find out.
Gezi Park consists of 18,000 square metres of green space next to Taksim Square. When the government ordered its destruction to make way for a shopping centre in the shape of a former Ottoman military barracks, a handful of environmentalists occupied the park. The images of their violent eviction spread across social networks and sparked outrage. The protest quickly evolved into a massive showdown with the government. Tens of thousands of people took over Taksim Square and began a sit-in in the park that lasted 2 weeks. Before being violently dispersed again.
Gezi was a bit like the straw that broke the camel's back. Then other grievances were added. The Gezi movement was not the answer to all our problems. But even if only as a show of force, it did give us hope. There's no reason why there shouldn't be another movement like Gezi. In fact, I would say that we have more reason today compared to 3 years ago. We face a lot more oppression and injustice. This can be over a message shared on social media or just for signing a petition. I'd say that the pressure has increased precisely to prevent such movements. But just as with Gezi, I think these new pressures will give birth to something new. I remain hopeful.
Suddenly, security guards interrupt our interview.
Belgeniz var mı? Bizim çekim belgemiz normalde yok.
Ama bana bir neden söyleyin yani.
Bazı haberlerde işte Gezi olaylarından dolayı hani yanlış bir haber yapmadan dolayı Büyükşehir Belediyesi'nde
3 years after the protest movement, cameras are still not welcome in Gezi Park. And on Taksim Square, even the smallest crowds or demonstrations are strictly forbidden.
You can watch that report in its entirety on Revisited on our France 24 website. That's all there's time for on this week's edition of Middle East Matters, but we'll be back again at the same time next week. Goodbye for now.